Hello, everyone. This is Professor Gunner again with Natural and Artificial Environment. And today we're continuing on by looking at the environmental philosophy of Aldo Leopold. Last time, we looked at an introduction to his book, A Sand County Almanac. And today we're just going to be looking at some of the ideas within one excerpt from the book that comes in one of the later chapters, which is known as the land ethic. And it is within this essay, you could say, in which he provides a different perspective for us when looking at the environment, a different way to view it, a different way to conceptualize it, as well as a kind of ethical system that we might use in order to conceive of it and treat it more properly. So recall, Aldo Leopold was an American environmentalist, forester, professor, explorer, and he's somebody who played a really pivotal role in the environmental movement in the US. So I think it only makes sense that we would take a look at some of his views more specifically. In this piece, Aldo Leopold is interested in providing us with, again, a different framework uh, with which to look at the environment. He notes near the beginning of this essay that every ethical system that we might devise or use is based on the premise that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. So, if we're going to talk about actions being moral or immoral, or how we ought to live our lives, there's going to be a necessary social component to that. And more particularly, all these ethical systems, whether you're looking at utilitarianism, deontology, the ethics of care, virtue theory, they all have this implicit assumption in which if we're trying to figure out how the individual should think and act, well, we need to consider that they are a member of a certain community in which they exist in a web of relations to the other things in that community. And an environmental ethic is going to be based on the same premise. Just as the ethics of care says that it is only through our relations and relationships that individual existence within a society or system is possible, Aldo Leopold is going to say something similar, although he's going to liken it to the natural environment on which our entire survival depends, whether we recognize it or not. Thus, when we're considering the morality of our actions, not only in how we treat ourselves and other people, but also the artificial and natural environments in which we reside, we need to pay attention to that system that we are a part of. All of the things that make it up, how we are related to the system, and how our actions impact the system in general. And so, the kind of ethical system that Leopold is going to be providing for us today is going to have a biological and ecological component because he's going to argue if it wasn't for the natural environment, we wouldn't all be here today. We depend critically on it for our survival. And even more specifically, not only do we depend on it for our survival, but we are still a part of it. Even though we construct these artificial environments for ourselves, we are still a part of the natural environment. And so it needs to be considered in our decisions and how we should think and act. What forms the basis of Leopold's critique of how we have been treating the environment is that we have the wrong conception of it. In this piece, it is clear that he argues we have not been respecting the land and its inhabitants. We haven't been respecting the natural environment out there. Rather, we've been abusing it for our own economic gain. We've been doing things like cultivating resources from the natural environment without really giving much thought to that. We destroy entire forests in order to make things like furniture and other products. We're clearing the Amazonian rainforest, for instance, in order to cultivate cattle grazing land so that we might eat more meat. We poison our water supplies. We are destroying biodiversity. We're doing all of these things which are destroying the natural environment. And Leopold obviously thinks that is not good. It's not good because the natural environment has some intrinsic value in and of itself, but it's also not good because we're undermining our own survival and the survival of future generations if we go far along down this path. And so, what he begins with, in order to outline this environmental ethic, is by outlining the relationship that we have to the natural environment out there. This probably isn't something that we think a lot about in Western society, given that we are somewhat disconnected from the natural environment. We live in these artificial buildings. We don't grow our own food, generally speaking. We probably don't spend as much time in the natural environment as we should. We certainly don't spend as much time in the natural environment as our ancestors did, hunting and gathering and living out there in the elements. Rather, as we've been saying this whole class, we've constructed these artificial environments for ourselves, and we've kind of taken for granted the things in the natural environment out there, that we are treating them the way that we ought to, that they will always be there, that this planet has infinite resources for us. But Leopold is going to say, the fact of the matter is that this isn't true. Rather, we are a part of the natural environment out there, whether we recognize it or not. And in fact, he's going to say, because his thinking is based in evolutionary theory, that none of the organisms on Earth are disconnected from each other or fail to influence one another. Rather, the actions that we are taking in our artificial environments, even, and our consumption practices and the activities that we engage in, they're having some kind of impact on the stuff out there. The plants, the animals, the wildlife, the fungi, all of that stuff. And so, what you consume in Western society, the products that you buy, the kinds of lives that you live, insofar as you are living within this artificial system that uses fossil fuels, that relies on vehicles, that relies on electricity, we are having an impact on the stuff out there. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. Thus, if we do think that there are things wrong with the natural environment because of human interference, we should be reflecting on that. We should be reflecting on how we are contributing to the pollution, the deforestation, the destruction of biodiversity, and we should consider all of those other organisms and ecosystems in our decision-making process, not just in how we treat other people, but in also how we treat animals, plants, and so on. Thus, what Leopold sketches for us is a framework with which to look at how we are related to all of that stuff in the natural environment. He calls this the biotic energy pyramid. And he says humans are participants in nature. We are a participant in this larger interconnected biotic system. And that's something that we need to keep in mind if we're going to continue living on this earth. So, we are a part of this pyramid-like system in which each layer in the pyramid depends on animals and plants doing their things, going through certain biological and chemical processes, the recycling of waste, and each layer in the pyramid depends for its survival on energy flowing into it from the layers beneath it. One way you could imagine energy flowing through this pyramid is as follows. Soil contains nutrients, vitamins and minerals, and they provide a space in which plants can grow. Plants, through photosynthesis, absorb energy from the sun, and they convert that energy into sugars and other nutrients, which are then picked up by insects and rodents and other animals like that. So the energy in the soil, it somehow provides for plants. Those plants cultivate energy from the soil and from the sun. And when insects and rodents eat those things, they're taking the energy of the plants for themselves and moving and living and breathing. Larger organisms are going to feed on those insects and rodents, say larger mammals or birds and things like that. And if you just kind of trace how these relationships work, energy flows up or is transferred up near the top of the pyramid. And we might say that at the top resides the largest predators or the humans, whatever those animals are at the top of the food chain. And so, through organisms doing their things, through photosynthesis, through pollination, through eating, energy gets transferred up the pyramid, and the energy doesn't just disappear when it gets to humans, for instance. The energy eventually gets transferred back down to the bottom of the pyramid, and what we have is a kind of energy cycle. This is helped through things like the water cycle, through the seasons, by these larger organisms and smaller ones, near the middle of the pyramid, defecating and dying, and those vitamins and nutrients and energy being recycled by the animals that do the recycling within these systems. And so what we have is a system in which there's energy constantly flowing between organisms. Thus, all the different organisms in the natural environment are interconnected and interdependent on each other. Each layer in the pyramid is going to depend critically on the layers beneath it. If there's a problem with the soil, the land, the rivers, plants are not going to be able to grow. If plants aren't able to grow, insects and rodents aren't going to be able to survive and reproduce. The animals that feed on those things aren't able to survive and reproduce, and eventually humans won't be able to survive and reproduce. So we exist in this interconnected system where all of the different organisms are interconnected and interdependent on each other. One way that Leopold says that we can trace these different relationships between the organisms and the relationships between the different layers in this biotic pyramid is through food chains. And they're represented by, describing how all of these different layers are related to one another and what eats what. For example, here's a food chain: soil, corn, cow, farmer. Soil is used to grow corn, which is fed to the cow, which is then fed to people. And what Leopold is trying to get us to see is that although we can represent all of these different relationships in these distinct food chains, none of these animals or organisms are completely distinct or cut off from anything else. Each species of organism is a link in many different chains. And even what's going on, for example, across the world in an ecosystem over there is going to have some sort of effect on ecosystems here given enough time. And so one of the reasons why we're treating the environment improperly is because we don't view ourselves as being in this larger interconnected, interdependent system, and because we're not looking on a long enough time scale. We're not thinking far ahead enough about the impacts that our actions are having and how that is going to endanger not only biodiversity, but thus the resources that we are able to cultivate from the land. Now, if you ever read environmental philosophy, or more specifically animal ethics, oftentimes you'll see people discussing how we need to treat animals better in general, or we need to treat this particular species better, or we need to treat this plant life better. But what Leopold is also trying to do in this piece is get us to widen our scope a little bit. Yes, we do need to think about how our actions are impacting animals. Yes, we do need to think about how they're impacting insects and rodents and plants and all these different things. But one of the novel things that Leopold does is he tries to draw our attention to the land. We should also be caring about the state of our rivers and our forests and our soil. All of these things are crucial elements within the biotic pyramid. And so if the health of the land or the soil or the rivers go, that is obviously going to have effects up the pyramid. And it's going to impact plant life and animal life and eventually human life. And so with his concept of the land, what he's trying to invoke is that the collection of every element in the biotic pyramid, which includes humans, animals, plants, soil, water, bodies of water, and so on. Leopold thinks that this is a useful way of describing how we are related to the natural environment because it helps us see the different impacts that our actions are having. We're kind of taking for granted nowadays that we can cultivate these resources from the natural environment, that we can go on living in these human and artificial ways, and we don't think too much about the impacts that that's having out there. But he tries to make clear in this essay that when any change occurs in the pyramid, that's going to affect every part of the pyramid as well. For example, again, if a particular species of rodent dies in an ecosystem, that's going to have an impact on the organisms that prey on it, right? That population is going to start dying. Once that population starts dying, whatever eats that population is going to start having problems. If a particular plant is necessary for an ecosystem to thrive, and Leopold might say every species in an ecosystem is playing an important part, then the insects that feed on that plant are going to die. And then the birds don't have a food source. And then the larger birds that prey on the smaller birds don't have a food source. So, no doubt, the activities of humans are having a lot of different impacts on these ecosystems and the natural environment generally. And so what we are doing is we're affecting the flow or the transfer of energy in the biotic pyramid. And through our agricultural practices, our production and consumption practices, even just our commute to work and things like that, we are influencing how that energy is transferred and where that energy goes. And that is going to have impacts on how things are growing out there, the health of our soil, the health of the land and water, and eventually, if we don't pay enough attention to this stuff, it may come back to bite us in the butt. And so he says, humans have instituted many complex changes in the biotic pyramid. We've compromised it, again, through our economic practices in various ways, and inadvertently, we've introduced a lot of invasive species into ecosystems, which interrupt those ecosystems as well and throw off the whole natural balance. We're engaged in these exploitative industrial and agricultural practices, and what we've seen over the last few decades is we're decreasing the health of the soil and the land, and therefore our ability to grow food. Our foods have less nutrients than they did decades ago. We've consciously and unconsciously brought many species to extinction. Again, we've introduced invasive species in places where they don't belong. And even though we haven't died out yet, even though we can continue to siphon resources from the natural environment, what Leopold is trying to emphasize and get us to see is that eventually these practices are going to have some sort of impact on us. If we continue to turn a blind eye to how we are influencing the natural environment of which we are a part and on which we depend, that is not going to be good for us. And so we need to sit down and really observe the impacts that we're having on the natural environment, the impacts that we're having on others, because it may be that, well, the future of the human race depends on it. Provided, we don't colonize other planets in the solar system before we die out, or blow ourselves up through nuclear war, or kill ourselves off with some virus or bacteria, any of that stuff. After having given us this framework with which to view our participation in and dependence on this natural system that we are all a part of on this earth, he then transitions into talking about how our views of the land and of the natural environment should change, and what we should be doing and encouraging in order to modify these destructive practices. He says that we need to learn to love, respect, and admire the land again as a living thing that is bigger than us, that has intrinsic value, that is living in some sense. It is a natural living being. We need to cultivate that kind of love and respect and admiration in ourselves and try to get others to see that that is the proper way to view the land as well. This might require reconnecting ourselves to the land. Again, we spend a lot of time in these artificial environments, watching our Netflix, scrolling on our phones. In a very real way, Leopold might say that we are alienated from the land because of technology and because of modern civilization, which has disconnected us from spending time in nature, from observing what goes on in it, and from thinking about it. At bottom, he says that we need to dispel the view that we are a slave to nature or its master. If we imagine ourselves just a slave to nature, that's not going to orient us properly, such that we would treat it the way that it ought to be treated in a sustainable way. Similarly, if we just view ourselves as a master of nature, as if we are in complete control and we're in charge and we can do with it how we want, that may lead us to destroy the beautiful natural environment that lies outside of our doorstep, and it may lead to our own extinction. Rather than these two extreme views, slave or master, Leopold encourages us to view ourselves as a participant in nature, as one of the nodes in this interconnected system. Because we do have the potential to live in balance, in equilibrium with nature. We have the ability to engage in preservation and conservation. We could protect species from extinction and prevent that. And if we just reoriented ourselves to the land, if we engaged in these different processes, we might keep it and ourselves alive. This is obviously going to be a very difficult task. Again, our heads seem to be, according to Leopold, in these artificial systems and in these improper ways of thinking. Thus, he encourages us to change how we are doing education. If we're going to change our relationship to the land, we need to change what we are teaching and telling people. He says that we need to increase education about the environment to children and other people. Express to them what our place in it is within this biotic pyramid lens or frame. As it stands right now, our educational system does not do a great job of explaining how we are interconnected and interdependent on these natural things and resources and ecosystems. And Leopold, I think, would argue when he was writing these essays that the educational system doesn't do a good job of cultivating that love and respect and admiration for the environment. Rather, it seems to do the opposite. If we follow again the critical theorists, the Marxists, and the neo Marxists, we might say that what our capitalist system is doing is producing good workers who obey, who don't think too hard, who produce and consume. And a lot of thinkers would argue so long as we are stuck in that frame, we are going to continue to alienate ourselves and we're going to continue to destroy what's out there, which we desperately need at the end of the day to survive. So he encourages us to modify the content of our education with a proper ethics of land use and respect. And we need to dispel these economically self-interested practices and this purely economic view of the environment. In conclusion, then, Leopold thinks we aren't viewing the environment properly, we aren't treating it properly, our education is messed up, and if we're going to continue to survive and reproduce, we need to change all of these things. What I think he believes we need to achieve is some sort of synthesis between the natural and artificial environments that we've constructed. Right now, you might think that based on what we're doing, that they are at war. And ultimately, that is not a good thing. That is not an ethical thing, these environmental philosophers are going to say. We need to take a good, long, hard look in the mirror at the kinds of lives that we are personally living, the kinds of institutions that we are supporting, and the kinds of laws that we have. Because if we don't, again, bad things could be coming down the pipe for us. We need to view ourselves as part of this interconnected system that in which each species' actions and lives has ripple effects on the rest of the system. If we don't do this, well, there might not be a habitable Earth for us in the future. Not to sound too pessimistic. Okay. I think that has done a good job of giving you kind of an overview of Leopold's environmental philosophy, of the land ethic that he provides, of this biotic pyramid frame that he gives us. In the rest of this unit, we're going to continue looking at other environmental perspectives. We're going to look at ecofeminism and deep ecology. And then, as you'll see near the end of the class, we're going to be talking about some more fundamental and metaphysical issues about nature and artificiality. I hope you found this interesting and enlightening. Think about these things and talk about it with your friends and family members. I will see you in the next lecture. Bye-bye.